Hello chaps and chapettes, and I hope you are all well and good today. We are finally looking at some famous felines from the front lines. Cats and the military have a long relationship with each other. From company mascots to the ever-important role of able sea cat, of course, aboard ships where they proved vital as their role of mousers, hunting down the vermin to keep the rations safe. But they also played another role, as with most animals in wartime, that of morale boosters, for the brave men and women caught up in the horrors of military action. Today we're going to look at 3 famous cats, a task that is actually rather hard, trying to narrow down a list of our feline friends, as there are so many, and so many well-documented ones at that, be it Able Sea Cat Simon or Unsinkable Sam, both easy to make the list, but so much has already been spoken of these kitties. I want to explore a few lesser known cats that saved the lives of soldiers. We're going to start with number 3, and that's the tale of Crimean Tom. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 was a war at a strange time. Gun technology was starting to become more and more advanced. The world was moving into ironclads from ships of the age of sail. Steam was now starting to replace the riggings of ships of yesteryear. The days of cavalry charges with sword drawns were coming to a close as rifles and cannons became more and more prominent. After a year-long siege at the city of Sevastopol, the Allied forces of French, Ottomans and British had managed to take the city from the Russians, finally at a huge cost of life from both sides. But even more dire was the supplies. After a year-long siege, the city was thought to have little left in it, and the Allied soldiers' supply lines were struggling to keep up with the demand. In late September, Lieutenant William Gere of the 6th Dragoon Guard was on patrol to try and find any supplies left by the fleeing Russian forces, when he stumbled across a curious sight. Sitting between 2 injured people, covered in dust and grime, viscera, sat a cat. Seemingly not to care about the commotion of a year-long artillery siege and foreign soldiers storming his city, Gere went over to the dusty tabby and found to his surprise the cat was very happy to be picked up by the British officer. He was taken back to the quarters and cleaned up, and named Tom. As the weeks passed, the men were all struggling with supplies, especially in the harsh Crimean winter time. Food was very rare. But a fat kitty was a welcome sight, and even better as a bedwarmer. Tom was having a grand time. The food for the men was low, but for him, rats and mice were abundant, especially in the hidden caches of food left by the fleeing Russians. The men did not let Tom's chubby nature let them by. One night they set out on a plan to follow the cat to his favourite hunting grounds. A group of French and British soldiers stalked their cat friend to a building that was no more than rubble on top of rubble, but they noticed the cat squeezed through some holes and vanished into the ground. An hour or so later the cat came back out, rat in mouth, and happily made his way home, back to the officers' quarters to go and warm up a bed or two, and retrieve a few cuddles. As Tom left, the men started to look through the rubble. It took a little time, but they found a cellar door, and eventually discovered an extremely large storeroom filled with supplies, enough to ward off starvation for the thankful men. And remarkably, few of the supplies were spoilt, thanks to the efforts of one brave cat. After clearing out the storeroom, Tom was slightly irked. His favourite hunting ground has now become a barren wasteland, but this crafty cat knew of several other caches around the city, many near the dockyards, where the men walked over the rubble day in, day out, missing the fact that they were walking over a food gold mine. Gere and his men took note to follow Tom and keep an eye on his spots. The cat once again would slip into the rubble and come out covered in grime with a fat rat between his teeth, and every time the men would find a small store of supplies and enough to get them through the worst of the winter. Gere grew very fond of his friend Crimean Tom, enough to have him brought back to England after the war had ended. Tom, who was thought to have been between 8 and 10 years old, sailed back to live with Gare back in England, where he spent his remaining years of life. Sadly, it seems the stress of war had taken its toll on Tom, and he passed away on the 31st of December 1856. But at least got to spend his last years in life in the luxury of his good friend Lieutenant Gere's house. After his death, Tom was actually stuffed and given to the Royal United Services Institution, a section of the Armed Forces designated to research military science, founded by the Duke of Wellington. At some stage, Tom was sold or lost from the institution. However, in the 1950s, a famous author, Lady Mackenzie, discovered a stuffed feline at the Portobello Road Market and identified the taxidermy Tom. He was donated to the National Army Museum, where he watches over until this day. Before we go on to number 2, we're going to look at one of the most famous division of cats. Yes, you heard me right, division of cats. That of the Mewing division of Leningrad. We move yet to another siege in Russia, this time the city of Leningrad. The year was 1941 and the German army had besieged the city, which lasted over 900 days. As you can imagine, the cold Russian winter was hard, but even harder for a city of civilians and soldiers having to fight off an army of invaders. But worse was to come. One survivor said, "We had a cat named Vaska, favourite in the family. In the winter of 41, his mother took him somewhere. She said they'd taken him to a shelter so that they could feed him, because we can't. In the evening, my mother prepared for something like cutlets. Then I wondered where we got the meat from. I didn't understand anything. Only then, it turns out that thanks to Vaska, we survived that winter." Unfortunately, the cutlets were, as you can rightly guess, Vaska. This, of course, was a double-edged sword, because without cats, a new army made its way into the city, and this was an army that the USSR troops could not defeat, despite their best efforts. They tried to shoot them, which had little to no effort, other than wasting much-needed ammunition. They tried fire traps, but the rodents were too smart. The huge mass of grey and black rats would swarm the streets and act like a sea of so thick you could not even walk through it, without risk of losing your boots. They tried having a few tanks and trucks running down the streets, patrolling the Obkirvan Defence Avenue, to try and crush the swarm of rabid rats and mice. Unfortunately, this didn't have a great effect, as the rats soon found out that jumping onto the tanks and trucks would help them with their trip and ride, and get them to the supplies much quicker, so many would just climb onto the vehicles and get a free ride. After the blockade was broken in January of 1943, an order was placed by the city council for 4 wagons of smoky cats, considered the best rat-catching cats in the business. Once the Mewing division had arrived, change started. The cats were stationed around the stores and mills. In 1944, more kittens were arriving in Leningrad. They cost 500 rubles and were snapped up by everyone for trade. To give you an idea, the cost of 1 kilogram of bread cost 50 rubles. The average salary for a soldier at the time was 600 rubles a month, so 500 for a cat was a fair amount, but people were in such need that they snapped them up nonetheless. The Battle of Leningrad raged on, cat versus rat, and the Soviets needed more troops for the fight, so a call was put out to Siberia. A 5,000-strong cat army came to fend off the rodents, and in one final battle the war was over. To this very day, cats are considered heroes in the city. Now 50 of their descendants stand guard in the museum, with their own papers and passports to guard exhibits from the rodent menace should they ever rise again. Number 2. Private First Class Hammer of Iraq. Next on the list is our most modern kitty of war, born to a litter in Baza, 50 miles north of Baghdad. The base of Balad in 2004 during the Iraq War II Desert Boogaloo. Hammer, an Egyptian Mew, was the only kitten to stay at the besieged base, not scared away by the constant gunfire nor the nightly artillery strikes. Hammer was old enough to no longer need full-time care and was capable of looking after himself, along with performing tasks for his army unit. Hammer was a regular to support the troops and often would cuddle up next to the men and women of the unit at night or in rest time to aid and give emotional support. But where Hammer's talents lay were with his masterful skills of insurgent and infiltration suppression on the base itself. Being a proud national of Iraq, Hammer did not one moment hesitate to help depose the despot ruler at the time, and aided the US soldiers and kept the base clear of enemy mice and rats, which were all aiming to deny the invading army of supplies. After verification of his 5th kill, Hammer was awarded the title of Private First Class. Later in the year, the unit received their orders to move out, and the motto of "No one left behind" was taken up by Staff Sergeant Rick Boesfield, and that included Private First Class Hammer. He contacted Alley Cat allies and military mascots, who raised $2,500 to get Hammer to Kuwait for medical treatment, including vaccination and an intercontinental flight to Colorado. In April of 2004, Hammer landed in the land of the free and the home of the brave, which indeed Hammer was, and was reunited with Staff Sergeant Boesfield and Sergeant Robert Scott, who met him as he arrived at the Denver International Airport. After landing in the US, he recognized his fellow veterans right away and was said to start purring as soon as he heard his officer's voice. Once back in the US, he retired from the army and stayed with his adopted officer, Boesfield, at his house with 5 other cats. He was said to have had a good life out of the army, enjoyed civilian life, along with picking up the American cat language quite quickly to communicate with his fellow brothers and sisters. Private First Class Hammer passed away in 2015 of natural causes. We'd return to Russia for our number 1 kitty, and that is Maruka, the Stalingrad messenger cat. Our final feline fighter brings us back to the hard winters and the frightful fighting on the Russian front as the German menace pushed forwards, and this time we go from Leningrad to Stalingrad, and yet another German siege. Between 1942 and 1943 the battle was tough, and key to victory was information and scouting. Key to this, for the troops of the Soviets, was a small, well-trained cat named Maruka. Now, I can hear you now, trained cat, blasphemy. There can be no such thing, you cannot train a cat. But Maruka was smarter than your average alley cat. This kitty knew that headquarters housed the officer's kitchen, which often had stock of meat, and even better for him, fish, fresh from the Volga itself. A welcome ration for a cat who has just run a message from the front lines across German-infested fields, dodging the enemy, with a message tucked away in his collar for the HQ to read for updates on the latest troop movements. Unlike radio or wired communication, cat communication could not be tapped, making it the most secure way of getting the message back to HQ in the morning. It's unknown when the Soviet scouts started to use Maruka's service, but once she was employed, messages were running back thick and fast. The cat would head out with a patrol in the evening under the cover of dark, and then in the cold murk of the morning, once the German troops had made their moves, once they had taken position, placed their artillery, a message was placed in a brave catmunist's kitty, who would leave his scout group and head back to base. Although this task was not an easy one, Maruka had to make a run across no man's land, an area under constant bombardment, machine gun fire, and only a brave girl with 9 lives could make it across unscathed, which she did again, and again, saving thousands of lives with the vital intelligence that she provided. For her efforts and life saved, Maruka was made a citizen of Stalingrad. Little is known of the fate of the heroic feline's life after the war, but Maruka became a legend to the soldiers of the siege, and was always a welcome visitor to the officer's kitchen. So that is some of our heroic cats of history. Now, of course, there are far too many to mention, but below let me know your favourite serving kitty. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please consider giving the channel a like and subscribe for An eclectic mix of military history, animals, gaming, motorsport, and, as ever, a huge thank you for watching this video. I really don't understand why you do it, but I love you guys for doing it. It really does make my day when I wake up in the morning and see somebody's actually watched my work. It amazes me. So until next time, this is me, Carl, Screezilla, wishing you all the best, and until next time, bye-bye.